Eye of the Sports Guy.
The Sports Guy.
This is important. It's top secret for your eyes only.
Just to set the record straight, they did not rope me into doing a podcast. I actually was excited to have one once I found out that you did not have to leave your house.
Now, Eye of the Sports Guy.
Here's the Sports Guy, Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the show. My name is Bill Simmons. I write thesportsguy.com for ESPN.com and ESPN the magazine. You can read all my columns at bostonsportsguy.com. Still not sure about the title for this podcast. Somebody suggested the BS report, which is really growing on me. And, I could really take that in a bunch of different directions, which you really can't with Eye of the Sports Guy. I'm taking some heat that it's too close to Queer Eye of the Straight Guy. A valid point. So we'll see what happens. I think the biggest obstacle right now would be convincing ESPN Radio to build me another graphic, because that had to take at least 20, 30 minutes. So we'll see if they break a sweat and do that for me. But I think we're leaning toward the BS report at this point. Anyway, we have an action-packed podcast for you today. It's really one of the most special moments of my career, or at least in the top 100. Our guest this week calls NBA games for TNT and the Yes Network, and happened to announce LeBron's 48 special last week, which is one of the reasons we wanted to have him on. The other reason, he's the greatest NBA play-by-play guy ever. And I will fight that argument to the death because I believe it's true. Anyway, Marv Albert, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Bill, thanks. I've really enjoyed reading your work over the years, and I think podcast is going to change your career. It's going to be the Turner.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We wanted to have you on because, not just because you're the best NBA guy ever, but because you called Game 5 of the Cavs-Pistons series last week. Now, during the first overtime, you said it was one of the greatest performances in NBA playoff history. Second OT happens. You reiterated this a little more emphatically, and Steve Kerr said it, moved up the list, all that stuff. Now, you're doing this game. At what point do you start thinking to yourself, my God, I'm going to be on ESPN Classic for the next 100 years with this game?
Whenever something like that is said, you kind of have it's almost like you have an argument with yourself. Now, is this there? I wanted to be careful as to when I say that, because...
Yeah, you're dropping the hammer.
It's a strong statement, and you don't want to be in a situation, sometimes you hear people go over the top, and they do it, kind of prematurely. So you kind of want to. I thought about it for a while. I just wanted to wait, and as it turns out, and then afterwards, there was so much written about other big games, and you start thinking about that. But I was happy to see there was affirmation about the fact that of course in Cleveland they said it was the greatest ever, but all around the country. I think people did realize in terms of the stage and the circumstances, the play, that it was a conference final, and that not only that, he did it against one of the better teams, at least during the regular season, as a defensive end. So, first I thought about it, and I thought Steve's comment was right on too. And then you start thinking about Bird against Dominique and 63 by Jordan, and then I had read, Bob Pettit with the 50. Bob Cousy had 50 in I guess 4 overtime.
Yeah, made like 25 out of 26 free throws.
Right.
Stat,
it was red clots against the Globe. No. But there was some of Jordan's best games, as it turned out, where he gave the ball up. It's either Steve Kerr or John Paxson. So that was kind of along the same theme, because LeBron was still looking for teammates. And when I looked at the tape back, I try to look at games after I do them, kind of spot check things just to pick, drive myself nuts about things I shouldn't have done or should do. But there were so many other opportunities for assists, but either guys, particularly Sasha Pavlovich, passed on shots or missed shots. And I think that's, as you look ahead to the Spurs, that's a concern, because I thought Danny Ferry, I understand what he did in bringing Donyell Marshall and Damon Jones, but they both have been very disappointing. And as it turns out, it's Daniel Gibson who's the guy who's been able to take advantage of the double and triple teams.
Yeah, he's been in the old B.J. Armstrong role. I'm glad you brought up MJ, because You saw a lot of his great performances in person, especially NBC had the rights, I think, starting in 80, what was it, like 90, 89?
90. The first year we did was Lakers Bulls in the finals.
Right. And that's when you had your signature call that they always use in the classic commercials where he shifted hands and you did a spectacular move by Jordan.
That's
but the best, as far as I could tell, the best MJ performance that you announced in person was the game when he just destroyed the Blazers with all the threes. That was amazing because he was not a guy who normally looked for three-point shots. And what I remember about that, I was working with the Czar, Mike Fratello, and we were there unusually early. We had to do some extra interviews, and he, like LeBron, who showed up early for several of his games after the first couple to warm up, and he rarely, it wasn't like Larry Bird who would come hours beforehand. He rarely would come early, and we happened to be there at the broadcast table, and there he is, and he's shooting threes. And then he comes out, and we had talked to him briefly, and then he hits all those threes, and you saw that. Actually, Magic Johnson was with us too that game, and he looks over at us at the table where he put his hands out, that pose that, like, he couldn't believe that he was, he was like apologizing that he hit all those 3-pointers because that was not usually part of his repertoire. But that was and that game also. That also had the subplot of Drexler, and that whole week leading up to the game, everybody was like, well, Drexler and MJ, statistically, they're pretty close. And then MJ just came out and just rammed a stake in his heart, basically.
Exactly, yeah. He would use anything to motivate himself.
Yeah.
I know Gary Payton bothered him when they went up against the Sonics because Payton actually outplayed him a couple of games. And I remember I happened to mention that on the air, and he's so he's probably one of the most competitive people in the history of sports.
Yes.
And he would use, even if I can recall games during the regular season, we did, as you mentioned, we did so many of the Bulls games. If there were a fan who was like annoying, and would get on him, he would, start talking to the fan, and that would motivate him. I mean, he would look for things. It was just like when Jeff Van Gundy made the statement about how he cons, opposing players. That's all he needed. We knew that was over.
Right.
And then he ended up, and Jeff afterwards, would say what a mistake that was to get him going.
It was always seemed like it was like looking, you don't want to look a pit bull in the eye, and everybody eventually graduated to that point with Jordan where it was like, don't talk to him. Don't trash talk him during the game. Don't mention him after the game. Just don't wake him up. Don't do anything.
Right. But he would get annoyed with the Drexler comparisons, and when Peyton did do a nice job for one or two games, in the series with the Sonics, that would definitely motivate him. Even in '92 in Barcelona when they had those well publicized scrimmages, which may have been the greatest games ever played, behind closed doors. Michael starred because he was so turned on by showing that, he was the best, out of that dream team group. So that, he didn't need much motivation there either.
That's one of my favorite stories, actually, is that the famous scrimmage where somehow it's 1992 and there's no cameras there. Like, you'd think there'd be one camera, like somewhere, like way above or something, but Jordan and Magic start trash talking and then pick sides, and everybody who was there said it was the greatest basketball game ever played. No videotapes.
Exactly.
But you've called some beauties over the years, and this is just what I could come up with off the top of my head. You were there for Willis's Game 7.
Right.
Larry Bird coming out of underneath the runway in Game 5 against the Pacers, which is one of my favorite underrated great.
Well, I agree with you when he banged his head on the
Yes.
floor. Yeah, and then he reappeared. That was right.
And you did a good job of that game because coming out of commercial, you threw out the Willis thing, but you did it carefully. You were like, obviously not the same significance, but it's hard not to remember Willis Reed when you see this happen. But another underrated one you did was the Bernard Isaiah game.
Yeah, that was. I've seen that played back many times, and that was at like Smoky Joe Louis Arena because at the time the Pistons played in the Silverdome, and I think they had some problems with the roof.
Yes,
was leaking, so they switched some of the games of that series. That to me was one of the great games of all time.
I watched it live. I agree with you. It was just absolutely so exciting. And you know, Bernard is one of those guys who's just totally slipped through the cracks, and you were there for some of his classics.
Yeah, you can make an argument for him, as you could for several other players, when they came out with the 50 greatest, and certainly Hall of Fame. It's almost like a Sandy Koufax career, because it was brief because of the knee injuries, but then he made that comeback when he was with Washington. But for about a 4 or maybe even 5 year period, he had to be considered. And you're talking about a guy who averaged, 30 points, 1 or 2 of those years, and led the league in scoring. But he had to be considered one of the top 3 at that time.
Absolutely, and
right?
almost beat the '84 Celtics by himself. Took it
Yeah,
to Game 7 with no teammates.
You're right. No, that was an epic duel. That particular game. I mean, Isaiah had like 16 points, as I recall, 94 seconds, and King ended up with 46. But what always impressed me about Bernard, and I think Kevin McHale was the same, and Jordan also the same way, they would always come back with another move after the summer. They worked hard, and Bernard had a variation of these baseline moves, and McHale did that too. I always noticed that he would come back with something to add to, and a lot of guys don't do it. Guys are in much better shape now than they used to be. They come to camp usually ready to play, but it's so rare to see, and you can name so many players. You say, why doesn't he come up with something in the off season? And here are some of the great players. Bird too, I put in that category, and Magic, that would come back with new stuff. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, and Bird actually had the one year where he was messing around with his left hand. It was almost like somebody's like messing around with converting their garage into an office or something.
Right.
And he came back and just was shooting left-handers, for the first 2 months of the season, just to see like how far he could take it.
Yeah,
and
LeBron did that. I remember we did an early game with LeBron. He came back but he stopped using it. I don't think he was ready. He had added, his left hand to his assortment, but it was just okay. That was earlier this year, and then that went away.
Yeah, I'm going to be most excited for LeBron when instead of hosting the ESPYs and doing stuff like that, he comes back with a 20-foot turnaround that nobody can stop. That's when I know the light bulb is finally at full 100 watts.
But, we were amazed because we saw him early. TNT had a preseason game, 4 years ago. And you can't make a judgment on one game, but and there were questions coming into the season. Here's this 18-year-old, starting his career in the NBA, and his jump shot was awful.
Right.
And actually it came along pretty quickly in his rookie year. Not great, but now it's decent. And as you say, it still could be better. I mean, he hit some fadeaway jumpers that were, off the charts in this past series, but he's still, there's still some room for improvement, even with LeBron.
Yeah, I feel like the turnaround is going to be the money shot for him because that was the shot that carried Jordan when he started losing his legs a little bit near the end of his career. Right. And LeBron naturally makes that shot every time. Like it's one of those things like he never shoots it, but when he shoots it, he's going to make it. So I feel like that's going to be one of his better ones.
Right.
Hey,
and I think also the judgment, and I think he's getting there, but and Michael used to deal with games in the same manner as to when he should be a passer and when a shooter. I thought he could have been more aggressive, and I'm sure he's just feeling his way because you forget that they really were very fortunate in terms of the draw that they got. I mean, they went against the Wizards, who were without Arenas and Butler, and their front line is certainly iffy. And then the Nets actually gave them a decent series, but they're without Kristich, and their front line does not match up. So here they play the Pistons, and people are saying, "Oh, they're going to get killed because of Detroit's front line." So LeBron goes into the series, and I think he was a little tentative in terms of what he should. That he really wasn't assertive enough early on, and even in game 6, where he may have been tired, the guy played 50 minutes, and came out strictly as a passer. And I think you have to be a little more aggressive. But that's a decision I think that will come as he gets more experience.
Well, you're sitting in midcourt for all these games. Now, you've seen MJ in his prime. Now you're seeing LeBron, who's not even close to in his prime yet, in my opinion. He's probably like 3-4 years away.
Right.
The way they carry themselves just on the court, because I think that's one of the underrated things about seeing a basketball game in person. Like, I remember, I've written about this before, but, you watch David Robinson on TV, it's one thing. But when you saw that guy in person, and he was just such a specimen. Like, he was like, just an awesome athlete to just see. And I always felt like Jordan was like that too, just the way he carried himself in pregame warm-ups, the way everybody reacted to him, the way he talked to the ball boys. Like, there was just something different about him. Do you see that with LeBron?
Yeah, you're right. That's an interesting point. With LeBron at a very early age in terms of how he has taken over, you could see in huddles, sometimes we showed it, that he's the guy talking to teammates. I mean, he's 22 years old. He refers to Daniel Gibson as the kid, So it seems as if, I mean, even when you first saw him coming out of high school, you say, wait a second, this is Danny Almonte,
Yeah.
You check the birth certificate because he really is very, very, very mature, and he has, guys who are older than him, the veterans who, because of the body language and obviously because of his skills, who are listening to him. And as you say, it was the same thing with Magic and with Jordan, and there's other special players you put in that category. And
I think Isaiah was
right. You only
like
see
that.
it when you're there. That's true.
Yeah, Isaiah was wired like that too. Like, because you forget, like, he's a point guard, and when you watch these guys on TV, you think in your head like point guards are like 5 feet tall, and you see these guys in person. Isaiah was like a solid 6'1", 6'1.5". And was so intense
and tough. He took a pounding, and he'd get up every time. And he would not be intimidated. It was the other way around. There were guys intimidated by him because same with Willis Reed. If you go back, because you always, I think players were always afraid that you never know that you might get punched. By Willis. I mean, the one time he did get involved, it was I believe it was opening night against the Lakers.
I'm so glad you brought this up. I was going to ask you about
this. And he
took
on the whole, I guess he broke, John Block's nose, and I think Rudy LaRusso happened to be in the wrong spot. And it all happened because someone held him back. And as a kid, he was once beaten up in that type of situation where someone was holding him. And Willis once told me about this, and he was took some hard shots, and he said he'd never let that happen again. And
so you were there for that?
I was, yeah.
Oh wow, because
it was an ugly scene, because here are guys, if there's a fight in basketball, which is the reason I think that David Stern has done an excellent job, because you just can't allow that. I mean, there's no protection. I mean, it's guys walking around in jerseys and shorts, and if all that's loose, it's, as we saw in the Detroit, Indiana situation, there's no controlling it. I was completely out of hand because it went into the stands, but you really have to curb all that, and that's the reason sometimes there are technicals given as an anticipation scenario. They're trying to stop it, and it's all judgment and subjective, and it's very hard, people are going to disagree with sometimes when those judgments are made, but it's pretty scary when you see something like that, that happened between the Lakers and the Knicks. And you go back to the Kermit Washington was circumstantial. What happened? I mean, that was unfortunate, but people point to that all the time.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is that in basketball, the fans are so close to the court. And you look at like baseball where they'll have a big fight in the mound, and it's fine because the fans are 200 feet away. But in basketball, and we've seen it happen, it can spill into the crowd. You can have a fan run on the court. Like, there's just so many different variables. But the other side is that so for some reason these guys are great athletes, but when they get in fights, mostly they just miss each other. They throw these terrible punches and miss.
Yeah, well, not only that, you have a lot of posing because they realize if someone gets in a punch, you could break your hand or break someone's nose. I mean, it's just, it's a horrible thing to think because of the lack of, it's not like they have boxing gloves and like a helmet like they wear in headgear like they wear in amateur boxing. I mean, it's a horrible thing to contemplate.
And they're big dudes. Were you at the game? There was a fight I remember, like vaguely, in the mid-'80s. Ken the Animal Bannister, who was called the Animal for a variety of reasons.
Right, yes.
He got in a fight with somebody at mid-court that was a good 50 feet away from everybody else, and it was like the Hagler-Hearns fight.
Oh, really? Who was it? I don't remember that, yeah. We didn't do all the games at the time. I mean,
I gotcha.
Yeah, but what I remember most about Ken the Animal Bannister, having to be a very nice guy, incidentally, was at one stretch when I think the Knicks were more like a CBA type team. It might have been Bob Hill coaching it, taking over for Hubie.
Yep.
And they had a lot of injuries. There was a guy named Chris McNeely started, and Bannister and Eddie Lee Wilkins. But anyway, they're playing in L.A. and the matchup is Kareem and Bannister. And in the huddle, Bannister says to his teammates and the coaches, "Let me have the ball. I can take this guy." And actually had a decent game against Kareem. But
and that's when Kareem started thinking about retirement.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Now, you grew up as such a big Knicks fan, and you called their games as you were breaking in the business. Do you still consider yourself a fan? Like, what point did the switch get turned off?
My early days when I first started on radio doing Knicks and Rangers, I think I may have been a little over-enthusiastic at the time. And then it stopped. And I just feel you have to be objective, which obviously many teams don't feel the same way. And I understand in certain markets where, that's okay. But I just felt that you really lose your credibility if things aren't going well. More so on radio because, you are the game. On TV, people see it also. But if things aren't going well and you don't say it, why would people believe that they are going well, when they are? You lose your credibility. And I've always felt, and I know it doesn't work in all markets because sometimes I think fans who are, so enthusiastic about the home team, they don't even want to hear bad things, or if a team is playing bad. I don't mean that you have to kill guys or kill the team, but I think you have to say when things aren't going well or a guy makes a mistake. And you're gonna hear it from players, but that's the way it goes. They don't have the same understanding. It's more of tunnel vision. I mean, athletes are taught to think only positive, and they don't even want to think about the negative. Same with coaches and managers. So, it's a different mindset. I must say, with the Knicks, when I first started out, when they were really, when they had those great teams in the 70s, I would never hear anything, and I was pretty close to that group because we traveled together so much, and it was different times, and it's easier when a team is a winning team, in terms of broadcasting the games. But there were guys who would come to me and say, "Hey, you were right," There was no question. That was a good point. Which you're not going to hear. The Busher and Bradley would always, it was a good point.
Well,
you're absolutely right.
You're
not going to hear that too often these days.
You've spanned the league and how it's changed because you're right. In the 60s and 70s, you traveled with the team. You went out and had steak and occasionally drinks with some of the players. They didn't have posses. And then as things changed in the 80s and 90s, and now I just think there's a disconnect between the media that covers the team and the players. Do you miss the old days where you could see Phil Jackson and be like, "Hey, let's get a hamburger"?
Well, I think you have to have a little distance. Otherwise, if I also do the Nets, and obviously it's easier for me if the team is successful. So you want them to be successful, but still there has to be that distance. Because if there's a situation where you have to be critical, I think you have to. I mean, same thing. Mark Jackson does the Nets with me, and he's still very friendly with guys. Like, he played with Vince Carter in Toronto, and he's close to Jason Kidd, but he criticizes them, and that's what I think is so good about Mark, because and Steve Kerr does the same thing, and he's dealing with guys he played with, but Otherwise you lose your credibility.
Yeah.
Speaking about Phil Jackson, it's amazing to see, and he's a great coach, and he's had tremendous success. But he would be the last guy that you would think at the time, when I think of Phil at the time, was Phil Action Jackson, that he would be a head coach. You thought of him as a scrappy player. He was one of these guys like Bill Cartwright, who in practice would hurt his own teammates, because of the sharp elbows, and he was basically a guy who defended on inbounds and was a pretty good player, actually. But we thought he'd be the art critic or the movie critic for the Village Voice, after his days as a Knick. And then he got interested in coaching. He was very close to Red Holzman, and he paid his dues in the CBA, and eventually went on to have this illustrious coaching career.
And you could say the same about Pat Riley, because he was he was like
true.
Chick Hearn's right-hand broadcast guy, and all of a sudden was coaching the team.
And really, it was almost just because at the time, I think Jerry wasn't it a co-coach at the time?
Yeah, it was.
I think Wes wasn't interested, and so hey, Pat, it's your job, and turns out also to be one of the the great coaches of all time.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Mark Jackson and Steve Kerr, because I think they're the two best color guys right now.
Yeah, I'm
somehow you're working with both of them.
Yeah, it's really fortunate to be able to work with Mark and Steve. They both have X and O capability, but entertainment value. Where you can kid and they can go right back at me, which I think is important.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask you, because you've had so many different partners over the years, and you've always managed to have this good-natured give-and-take chemistry with them, no matter who it was, which I think is like the single toughest skill for a play-by-play guy to have. You don't have to name names, but has there been a time over the past 35, 40 years where you matched up with somebody and you just didn't have the chemistry?
Probably my earlier years, where I was also kind of finding